And I'll just make a brief introduction. Though you have met Sarah before, she has come in today to provide the overview presentation and information of the results of phase 1 of the DFI study. So Sarah Odio is the Assistant Director of Housing with DFI. She'll go through her presentation, and then afterwards we'll be happy to talk through potential next steps as well as answer any questions that you have.
Hello, thank you all for having me here today. It's really exciting to be here because we are at a great point in the process where we can actually come back with some information to help you all make the next decision so we can get into the most exciting part of this process. So our plan today will be to review our process, where we've been, where we're going. We will get into what you're looking for, which is the initial analysis of the sites that you previously identified in downtown. And then from there, we'll cover sort of this secondary site that we identified. And then we'll talk about some next steps, what comes after this. So just for anyone here that is not familiar with us, I am with the Development Finance Initiative. We are a program of the UNC Chapel Hill School of Government, and our work focuses on real estate development and finance. We come to local governments and we help them put together real estate development deals that meet both the public and the private sector interests. You always typically see me. I've got my colleague, Marcia Parrott, online for questions. She's actually our new director with the Development Finance Initiative. But there's a team behind me. So I work with various specialists that come in and help us do this work. So what we have been focusing on for this project, as you all know, we're doing 2 separate projects, and we'll have a moment at the end to talk briefly about Ferry Road. But for this project, our goal here was to identify sites that would be good opportunities for affordable housing development. And we do this by taking a high-level view of feasibility, right? What is possible within the market, within the physical and regulatory constraints of the site, and within the financial constraints of the type of product that you want to get. And in this case, that is affordable housing. And what DFI does that is different from what the private sector does, because everything I've just described is something that any developer would do, is that we come in and we layer in the public interests. And we say, what is it that this community wants to achieve? Now, I say that what we've done so far is high level, because what comes next in this process is going to be much more site specific. So you all are going to have the opportunity to identify up to 3 sites that you want to proceed with. And then we're going to really get into the details of that site. And we will identify very site-specific public interests. So, if you're in downtown, if you're elsewhere, what is it that the context of that area requires of this site? Should it just be residential, or are there other things that you can achieve with the site as well? So that is part of phase 2, which will come next. And our goal then, as part of that process, will be to identify a development partner to actually execute on the vision. So we always say that our work is not meant to be a report that you leave on your desk. We will get you a partner. We will get you shovels in the ground. All right. So what we've accomplished to date is everything that needs to happen in phase 1. And we have done some preliminary engagement, some one-on-one outreach to organizations in the area that have either a very specific interest in affordable housing development, whether they're because they're in the space or because they serve residents that would benefit from affordable housing. So when we go into a process of analyzing a site and its feasibility, one of the key things that we need to do first is, what are the priorities here, right? And so these are the high level. Remember, each site will have more specific ones, high level priorities for site ID. So the site selected for affordable housing development should increase the stock of housing for low and moderate income households in a mixed income setting, leverage underutilized publicly owned properties, capitalize on existing infrastructure, utilities, and access to employment, and maximize the opportunity for private investment in order to optimize your public investment. That is always the goal in our work. Any dollar that you can put somewhere else is a good thing. So as part of our initial work, we did a full housing needs assessment that you all have access to. And just a brief summary of what we learned through that. None of this really is going to be a surprise to any of you, but there is an overwhelming need for housing in this community. There are about 8,100 low, moderate income renter households in Buncombe that have severe housing problems, which means that they are either spending more than 50% of their income on housing expenses, or they are living in substandard housing. The demand is greatest within the small elderly household segment and families, small families. There is, even this is the demand now, right? This is what we see from the data, which lags a couple years back, but there is significant pressure on all housing types. So we're seeing rents increase and the cost of living rise, and vacancies remain very low across all products, which indicates to us that whatever the issue was, or however many households were in a bad situation a couple years ago, it's probably gotten worse today. Now, I really want to emphasize that as we focus our work on delivering new units, there are a significant number of units that are currently subsidized, about 915, that will reach the end of their expiration in the next 10 years. So as you're thinking about delivering new units, let's not forget that there are existing ones that may not be affordable in the next decade. And on top of that, when thinking about renters, home ownership is increasingly out of reach as the interest rates rise. Even as they plateau now, they're really not going back down, and home prices continue to rise. So getting into the site suitability, we had, as I said earlier, primary emphasis on these Orange County-owned properties previously identified by county staff. And then we did a secondary search for additional sites that are suitable for the low-income housing tax credit. Now, you're going to hear me throughout this process talk quite a bit about LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit. Why do I do that? Well, because it is the number one funding source to deliver affordable housing units in North Carolina, across the country. So from its inception in the 90s, it has taken off as the primary funding source for housing development and is now delivering more units than any other federal subsidy. Now, there are two different types of tax credits. So without getting too deep into the weeds, there's a 9% that is very competitive, and there's a 4% that's less competitive. But as you can tell by the numbers, one gives you a much greater subsidy than the other. And so kind of back of the hand, let's say 9% is 90% of the capital, 4% is 40% of the capital. Now, if you could see the bar in orange, those are 9% tax credit projects that have been delivered in Buncombe County on an annual basis since 2009. Now, you are going to get and continue to get 9% LIHTC projects delivered in this market. It gets more challenging over time with land, but there's likelihood that this year and next year, there will be roughly 80 units delivered through this program on an annual basis. Where we see sort of an overall increase in the number of units delivered through this program on an annual basis is when we get into the 4% tax credit projects. And you can see here that you have participated in all of the yellow 4% tax credit projects that have come through Buncombe in the last 10 years. And you can see there that with the 4% tax credit, you can deliver in one project 200 units, maybe even more with an exemption. So the difference in what can get done is significantly more with the 4%, but the gap is bigger, right? So it is a question of trade-offs and having a conversation about public investment. And I'll get into that, which is how do we fill and how do we build housing? There are loans that play a critical part of funding affordable housing. So it's never just the tax credit. We try to maximize whatever loans are available. The tax credit comes in as equity for the project, so it's cash for the project. And this tax credit, I think one important thing to note is that the tax credit has a value attached to it that does fluctuate on an annual basis with the market. So what would have been worth, 94 cents last year, today it's worth 84 cents. And so that does impact the gap and what you're going to hear from developers about what is needed. It's taken a while. With the 9%, you can access another low interest loan through the housing finance agency that runs it. And so when I say today what the funding gap is, that is what is left after we have exhausted loans and tax credit equity. So we don't start with the funding gap, we end with the funding gap. And then even with the funding gap, there's the option for a developer to defer a portion of their fee. That only goes so far, right? Because that is capped, how much they can defer and what they can accomplish. There are charitable sources that can fill this. But as I talk today, I would like you all to assume that that funding gap will primarily have to be filled by the county. So I said I did a high-level site and financial analysis. What does that mean? So off the top, no site-specific public interest. So for example, if you wanted to incorporate a daycare or a childcare space into the building, we have not done that yet, right? It's a test fit, which just means that we're drawing literally a block on a piece of land. And there's so many factors that impact, construction. But we're looking at what you can fit within the physical and the funding constraints with a site. No design details, so we're not proposing a big white box for any of these sites. And it doesn't necessarily adhere to zoning at this point. So I'm sorry, planning department. We looked at a mix of 1 and 2 bedroom units, if less than 80 units, and we started to incorporate 3 bedrooms as we went into the bigger developments. We incorporated about 1 parking space per unit. Now, this is going to be, it's frustrating to say this, but parking really becomes the limiting factor in the amount of density that you can achieve on a site. So how many units, the density that you can get on a site. And because of this on-site parking requirement, for example, on Cox Avenue, we know we have a parking deck 2 blocks away. It would be great if we could use that parking, but unfortunately the tax credit program isn't going to allow that. There is also a minimum parking count that comes with the tax credit program of about 1.7 spaces per unit, but that is something that can be reduced if local regulations allow it. The on-site requirement, though, that is going to be our greatest limiting factor. So what we did here with this work is we demonstrated the maximum density with the lowest cost parking option. That means either surface parking or podium parking, which is really when you just elevate the building 1 story and fit that parking in that single story underneath. Structured parking is possible, right? A parking deck is always possible. But when you're looking at a site and you think, if we did parking structure there, we could get so many more units, I want you to remember that for each of those, we're talking about an additional roughly 20,000 per parking space. So 20,000 per unit. And so for that reason, that might be a site-specific interest, right? In phase 2, you might say, we need a parking deck there, we need more units. At this point, I just wanted to give you this kind of minimum cost into entering the affordable housing space on these sites. These financing estimates that you'll see are based on these test fits, right? And we looked at targeting incomes that would maximize your ability to win a 9% tax credit. And because you don't really have to compete for the 4%, we did a lot more mixed income and tried to maximize the rental income within the affordability space for the 4% tax credit. We're assuming the use of project-based vouchers. I think you all got an update recently about voucher use, and it's something that you've all had a little bit of insight into. And these vouchers are really going to be critical to providing units that are affordable for the most vulnerable, extremely low-income households. But it will require working very closely with the housing authority. It like clicks, and then it goes, and then it doesn't go. Okay. Any cost that you see will exclude the potential land value for those properties, but I will indicate what that value is. And again, phase 2, we are going to get into all of the details, and you'll get to see multiple scenarios. So you'll get to see a plan that has more 3 bedrooms, for example, if that's what you wanted, or that has deeper affordability or more mixed income. Just to give you an idea of the rents that we modeled, okay, this is just for this high level, 30% of the area median income using those project-based vouchers. So the rent there would be a portion of that household's income, so 30%. And then we've got rents for 1 bedroom ranging from about $660 up to about $1,500 for a 3 bedroom, 80% AMI unit. So that might feel too high. That might feel like the good mix, right? That you're going to have units between 600 and 1,500 within the same building. But we'll talk about that more in the next phase. And so this is serving households that are earning between $28,000 and roughly $58,000 a year. And so you could see the difference in the mix for a 9% tax credit project and a 4%. So let's get into these primary downtown sites. Now, I want to say off the bat, you're going to be thinking about land. You're going to be thinking about, okay, what are we doing with our land here? I want to make it clear that there are various ways in which you will be able to convey property. One of the top ways that we typically recommend actually to our clients is ground leasing. But we'll have a discussion in that phase 2 about how you want to do it. Ground leasing allows you to hold on to the property in perpetuity, which is different from if you were to just sell and convey it at no value, which is what we're looking at here, to the developer. So jumping in, the 3 sites. I wouldn't say they're actually 3 sites, they're 3 clusters, because one of them, the first one that we'll look at, is really multiple sites. They're, as you can see, just kind of, our goal is to try to get all these properties together and do one great, big, awesome one. But there's a lot happening in between them. And that's just the reality of this area, which is great. It's downtown. But these are our top sites for LIHTC development on Cox Avenue, which would be 50 and 52 Cox Avenue. Okay. We looked at, I think this is 94, 96 Cox on the corner of Cox and Hilliard. This is awesome building on the National Register. It's got about 15,000 square feet in it, which means it's just not big enough to get more than 12 units. So compared to other sites where that'll be much more high impact, this one just isn't gonna get you that density and allow you to preserve the building. And on top of that, even if you were to bring the building down, it's just a very narrow, topographically challenged site. So, you know, better to stick with the preservation angle, or at least, you know, think about using it for something else complementary, right?
Sarah, just to be clear, you're saying you could put 12 units on the parking lot behind the building?
No, in the building.
Inside the building.
If
Okay,
you
inside
wanted,
the building, if you converted it into like a residential building.
yes.
Okay.
If you were determined to use the building for residential, something that we did look at and we provided you some details on would be affordable condo model, so condominiums. There are a lot of challenges with affordable condominiums, which you'll hear a lot about when we talk about Ferry Road, related to HOAs and all of that. So it would be tough, and you would get about 10 to 12 units compared to other sites. Running in the wrong direction. So these two sites that you see in red are just kind of hanging out on their own right now, right? They're just not big enough to get enough density. And because of, reminding you of that on-site parking requirement, they can't help us in the way that we want them to help us. Ideally, we could have used them both for parking and really maximize density on the other sites. But they're simply technically too far from the actual site to qualify for parking for LIHTC. Now, something that could be a possibility, and that when we go, and if we were to go into phase 2 for Cox Avenue, we would look at, is looking at Sawyer Street. Is Sawyer Street critical to this area? Is there a possibility of working with the city to close Sawyer Street? And in doing that, would you be able to get a pretty big, pretty cool site? So looking at sort of a 3D box, this is not the design, for 50 and 52 Cox Avenue. Just looking at 52 Cox, you can see a 4-story structure here with podium parking. And in doing this, we could get about 80 units on that 1 acre with an estimated gap per unit competing for the 9% tax credit to get those 80 units. Now, a reminder that the limiting factor here is that parking. We also looked at 50 Cox Avenue, which currently has the Elections Warehouse. 52 Cox Avenue currently has the ID building. And that site alone is kind of too small and too sort of weirdly shaped, and is only about 0.4 acres, so less than half an acre. So we were able to get about 40 units above a podium here. Because of the size of it, it's just too small to compete for 9%. And on its own, it's way too small for a 4% tax credit. So we looked at combining it with 52, if we were able to, and doing 120 units together using the 4% tax credit. And with that, it would be about $60,000 in gap funding per unit to achieve that. Now, if we were able to close Sawyer Street, we could potentially get more density because we could get more parking on site. And there's the potential for a 9%, 4% tax credit deal, which in mixing the two tax credits, you could bring down the overall cost per unit. At the moment, between these two sites, it's just simply too small for a mix of a 9 and a 4.
And
Yes.
did you mention, we had a conversation preparing kind of for this presentation. You mentioned that like maybe one solution, if you can't close the street or don't want to close the street, might actually be doing like literally a bridge. Like if you developed all these parcels, like doing a pedestrian walkway elevated above the street, so it's quote unquote connected, which seems completely silly, but the rules are what they are.
I think I said that
Right, so.
jokingly, but it is possible.
Well, I mean, if that's literally what's preventing consideration of developing downtown properties, is that the parking would be like across the street, which is, again, it just seems like a really, a bad policy, frankly, that's how that they would look at these as unconnected when they're literally connected, but for a public street. I mean, this is a city, we have streets. I mean, like what, that's so illogical. So that could be something to be looked at, right? Because if you did that, then you could say it's connected, right? Someone lives over here, they walk across, and the parking's over there. It's connected. So it would cost some money, might look kind of weird, but maybe one thing to consider when you go into more detail.
Yeah, and so phase 2, we're going to look at a lot of different scenarios here. So we will look at a version without tax credit and what that flexibility would allow. And what that could look like, remembering, though, that we're leaving a lot of equity on the table. But there are other ways to do it and think about it. My presentation's gone. Okay. But yeah, something like that, I think we'll look at it. You know, we'll see, is that feasible though? How high does it have to go for trucks to get through if you're going to keep it open? And there are a lot of sort of elements involved with putting two bridges over a road in downtown. That'll be an interesting conversation, I think, and might push for the closure of Sawyer Street. So, looking at Valley Street, we looked at two different versions on Valley Street, looking at just the north portion, if for some reason preserving the southern portion would be impossible or difficult, or there were other uses preferred there. I also want to flag that on the south end, there is some city work that's being done around reparations, and so we want to be considerate of that, but we can do that looking at the entire site and just the north portion. Estimated unit count, if we just use the surface parking lot on the north portion of it, we could get about 72 units on this site. It's about 1.1 acres with an estimated gap per unit of 56. This site is not competitive for 9% tax credit, and it's because it is next to the Buncombe Detention Center. The detention center, being next to a detention center, deducts 3 points, and that's the end of the application. But it does make for a good 4% tax credit development site. And I want to remind you, when you look at this, that again, just boxes, and as we go into the phase 2, if you want to proceed with Valley Street, we would consider different kind of ways to design this site so that you don't have a bunch of balconies looking out into the detention center. And most importantly, so that it feels oriented towards South Charlotte Street and is more connective towards South Charlotte Street. So we looked at the entire site, and of all the sites in the primary in downtown, this is the one that can get us kind of the most units for what we have available, right? And it's about 150 units over 6 floors with surface parking. An estimated gap per unit of about 51. You'll see it's a little bit less than if we do fewer ones, right? Because you're distributing things like site work across more units. You're distributing things like the cost of the bond that comes with a 4% tax credit across more units. And so there is a benefit with 4% in particular to do more. That's why I say 40 is just too small, because it's going to be so much more per unit than what you could do here. So again, don't imagine that this is, you know, where this building would be and what it would look like. But that's the density we can get with this site. So you can do quite a bit here. Reminder that there is a building on the site now that would need to be current tenants relocated and building demolished. So looking at the Woodfin parking lot, so we were asked to look specifically just at the surface lot on 35 Woodfin. On this site, we could fit about 48 units. It is competitive for the 9% tax credit on about an acre with surface parking. This, because it's so small, right, there is no gap because we don't exceed sort of the limit. The challenge here, and I'll remind you, is that on an annual basis, if you do nothing, or even just minor participation here or there, but basically if you do nothing, you are going to get 80 units through the tax credit program, 70 to 80 units through the tax credit program. So in pursuing a project here on this site of this size with just 48 units, you're basically trying to compete against the private market to do less. So from that perspective, you know, it's giving up a very valuable piece of land, or a portion of a valuable piece of land to do less than what the market would achieve. We had to consider the existing building that's there as thinking through this. So that's what you see here, which is considering access driveways into that existing building, but we would be gobbling up all the surface that's there, and we'd be foregoing an opportunity to consider the entire site as a whole and look at what could we do with a full, 3 acres versus 1 acre. So looking at the properties side by side, we've got the Woodfin parking lot, 52 Cox, which we would kind of proceed and approach as, looking at the cluster of sites and figuring out what was possible there. Valley Street, you know, we could look at, and probably phase two, we would ask you to just say, okay, just do Valley Street. And we would consider North Lot, the entire lot, and various scenarios there. But you can see in red here, the estimated gap funding for each of these projects. And I want to draw your eye to the estimated land value in downtown of these properties. So per acre, we're talking about 1.8 to 2.2 million in land value. This means that you as a county are doing something extraordinary to reduce barriers to building housing in downtown. Because no private affordable housing developer is going to spend $2 million to get into downtown. They can't. So without participation of those that already own land in downtown, there's just no entry for affordable housing developers. But also, as you think about your contribution, there is a land value there in addition to the gap funding per unit. So I ask you to kind of hold both truths in your mind as you consider this. Right. I'm going to keep moving to the secondary side, or do we want to pause on the primary?
I want to have to ask a parking question.
Yes. Oh, no.
I'm always struck by all these aerial images of downtown that show how we use so much of it to just temporarily store cars. But there's a parking requirement with NCHFA, right? And then also city zoning. So can you just kind of, maybe I missed that, but can you explain the difference between those two?
Yes, so NCHFA, they have what they call qualified allocation plan, and in that they say you have to provide 1.75 parking spaces per unit, unless there is a local ordinance or local regulations that allow you to have less, that have a lower threshold. And so we are operating on a lower threshold in the assumption that the local government will want that here. We see it in downtown Durham, where they actually were able to reduce their parking requirement for their affordable housing projects to about 0.6 to 0.7 spaces per unit. We see it in Charlotte. We see it in kind of all the comparable downtowns in North Carolina.
So would it be correct for me to say, like, whatever ends up on our LIHTC application would be whatever our zoning permit expectations are? If we
Would
got that
allow,
lower
yes.
even?
It can't go to zero. I just want to emphasize that zero isn't a possibility because it's one of the stated goals to make sure that residents have access to parking.
Yeah.
But you can reduce it considerably from that 1.75 requirement per unit.
You can, and
So-
just to clarify, you can, if it's allowed through zoning, down to 0.6.
No, well, it's a negotiation with the Housing Finance Agency. So you need to make a compelling case that you can reduce it. They won't get behind zero. So they haven't set a minimum other than it's not zero. So it really just comes down to, Rocky Mount, for example. I've got a project there now. They have a zero parking requirement in their downtown. The Housing Finance Agency looked at the market and they said, it's Rocky Mount, you need parking. Let's do 1 per unit or 1.2.
Okay, but are there, but is 0.6 potentially, because I think the CBD, I don't think there's a parking requirement in the CBD. So you could, under zoning, I think you could theoretically do no parking. But in terms of what's realistic with the Housing Finance Agency, could we shoot for something like 0.6
Yes.
parking units per acre? Because currently the working assumption in the model is 1, which may be
Yes.
just being more conservative. But if that did go down to 0.6, I mean, that would increase the number of units by like 50% right off the bat or something close to it, right?
Yes.
Yep. Great.
And again, this is the high-level part of the analysis. So I try to not reach for the stars at this point, and phase 2 we'll get into
The
those.
Skyway. Or Subway.
All right, moving into the secondary sites. So we didn't take it for granted that the only sites are in downtown. We looked elsewhere. We looked all across the county. We used the criteria set by the Housing Finance Agency through their plan about proximity to amenities, about proximity to disamenities. So you need to have a distance between, and access to transit, which is like the most beneficial thing for one of these developments. And then we added additional criteria above and beyond what they require, just to be realistic. So publicly owned or privately owned sites with a path to site control. So if someone already has a plan on it, we won't, we won't flag that one. And it should have at least an acre of developable land. So we looked at the slopes across the sites that met the primary criteria, and used sort of an industry standard of 50% of the sites with slopes less than 15 degrees, or if less than 15 degrees, non-contiguous. So we were really just trying to make sure that we could actually build on any sites that we flagged. And we wanted to be located on existing sewer systems. Because as I move through this at the end, I'm really going to sit on the idea of like, there are a lot of opportunities, right? If you have time and you want to kind of see them through. What we're looking at through our process, because you've got us here, DFI's here, we're ready to go, we're ready to see a project through and find you a developer. What is something that you can move on now? And which ones do you want to prioritize? And so, on existing sewer systems is a good one. So again, we identified a lot that are competitive, but one of the top sites that really kind of rose to the top is 180 Irwin Hills, which is currently owned by the county. It has kind of a county, it's an EMS or some other uses on it, and a warehouse. We can fit cleanly about 160 units on 4 floors on what is a roughly 3.3 acre site. This is a site that if you were to add a bus stop nearby with a sidewalk running through the site to it, you could potentially compete for 9%. And so this is a site where we could potentially look at using a mix of 4 and 9% tax credits to bring down the overall gap per unit. It could also just be a very clean 4% tax credit deal with 160 units at about $50,000 per unit. So adding that one into the mix, again, there are so many other opportunities. This isn't the only one that's out there, but this is definitely a more kind of immediate, and I say immediate like in the next 2 years. I had that question, someone's like, immediate feels like tomorrow. No, like next couple years we could get a shovel in the ground. Opportunities here in Buncombe County. Adding that the Irwin Hill site is not downtown, so it is a lower value property relative to the other county-owned sites. So, reminder that every site has the potential to support housing. So the Cox, Woodfin, Valley, you have opportunities on all of them. The question is, what are going to be your higher impact opportunities? We can help you with up to 3, right? And we talked about 4 sites. So you could move however you want at this point. Reminding you of the criteria that we used at this point to select and to analyze these sites, and something that really stuck out to us as sort of like one of those primary comparison things was, what really stands out to you as underutilized that you could move pretty quickly with. So what happens next? Okay, so this timeline has like multi-universe. It's a multiverse. Okay, you could proceed now, right, if it's in the budget and there's the ability to proceed. And so what we would do is the first thing we do is we go out there and we do community engagement. And we get to work right away on defining the site-specific public interests. We will engage an architect right away. So when you're thinking about budget, one of the key things is an architect who's going to get into the nitty-gritty of these sites with DFI leading that process. And so the site analysis, we'd want to engage an architect right away to spend a good amount of time looking at various scenarios. The financial analysis to get you really much more refined estimates of what it would cost and using different financing models. And then so if we were to start immediately, our final recommendations would come to you in, August, let's say, for these sites that you choose to proceed with. And then we'd be identifying a partner in the fall and starting, the negotiations on agreements. Agreements take time. It's exhausting how long they take, but our goal is to always protect you and your investment in any project that we do. So we expect that time is a good thing in this process. If you wait till the next budget cycle, the next fiscal year, we're just pushing that back. And this is also possible for us to a July start date, doing everything I've described here, but starting in July and soliciting a developer into the next year. All right. I was gonna do a quick Ferry Road update, but I don't know if you'd like to pause here, or should I? I'm gonna get 2 slides, and then we'll do like a whole thing. Okay, so just a quick Ferry Road update. We're deep in the site plan, so everything I've been saying we're gonna be doing in phase 2 for these others, we are doing for Ferry Road. It's at an exciting point where we're really getting to see what could happen here. We are in the process of considering how we're gonna proceed for entitlement for this site. So how we're gonna get this zoning in place. One option would be for the county to initiate the conditional zoning process and to really drive this. This is DFI's recommendation. The other is for the county to select a developer and let them drive through that process down the line once they're already kind of on the hook. But I will emphasize that we highly recommend that the county drive this, especially because, you know, the city hasn't done this process for a site like this that many times. And so we're really excited that we get to work with them and figure out a vision for the site that we can get the zoning in place for in advance and allow for some flexibility for the developers. And so there will be additional community engagement. I say in the spring, summer. It depends because we're thinking about the entitlement process now and how to kind of double up what's required from that with this process. And so that timeline is, we're busy, we're in the middle of it, we're in the thick orange with, as I said, that engagement coming kind of spring, summer, and after we make recommendations for the site, potentially more if necessary. So, any questions?
I want to make sure I understand a couple of things. So on the downtown properties, currently the limiting factor of getting more housing units is the parking situation. Is that the only thing that's really limiting that at this point?
Parking is the primary.
Okay.
You know, we'll think about things like stormwater, like amenity things, but parking is the driving one. And so in phase 2, when we get into it, I mean, we look at Cox Avenue, we want to take a close look at the soils to make sure that we can get a good amount of density on that specific property. So there's certain elements like that when we start digging into the site, there may be others, but at this high level point, it really is, and sadly so, parking that is the limiting factor.
It really would change things a lot if we could get down to 0.6, right? I mean, some of the 9% would turn into 4%, or a combination of 9% and 4%, and maybe some of the sites that look kind of too small for a 9% might suddenly look more interesting from that standpoint. So it is, but we can't have that negotiation until we bring a project forward, right?
Yes.
So that's
It'll
part
be
of
the developer that has that negotiation, but we hope to speak to the Housing Finance Agency frequently throughout the phase 2 process so that we're not making assumptions that are too far out of field.
And from other recent projects, though, you do feel like there's some good, or do we have some good examples to point to in other, you know, urban areas, like
Yes.
downtown type environments in other bigger cities where they have gotten to that? So we're not going to be a complete outlier if
Yeah,
we bring
there are
forward a
precedents,
0.6
yes.
proposal for a central business district site.
Yes.
Great.
And I'm glad you brought up the ground leasing, because one thing I hear from the community is they're very concerned about, well, the fact that you brought up, right, that 915 subsidized units are getting ready to expire. So they're concerned with how we go about this process and for long-term affordability. So I'm definitely interested in hearing more about that aspect as we proceed.
Although that is something we could negotiate that too. If we did decide to sell the property, we could make permanent affordability written into the,
That's a little bit more
agreement, right?
challenging in an interesting way. The ground lease has kind of more active controls. I'm not an attorney, but part of phase two will be to get into the details of that. I've had this same exact conversation with multiple clients because the question always comes back to how do we guarantee in perpetuity? And a ground lease is really the most active tool that you have available to you. But there are others. And what's important, though, is that a ground lease today no longer deters developers. So it's becoming more and more common every day. So it's not something that we would say, you got to be careful because developers don't like it. No.
well, I mean, aside from these particular parcels, that is kind of an important point because we're always involved in all these negotiations with developers around like what happens beyond the, the LIHTC financing period where they could go to market rate. Some developers say, well, we're willing to write into it that it's permanently affordable, but it would be great to know just kind of in general, if we don't own the land and aren't doing a ground lease, do we have some legally enforceable mechanisms to build that in? Because I think there's going to be a lot of projects where we would want to really advocate for that beyond our publicly owned properties.
But yeah, I agree. But I will emphasize that the fact that you're putting publicly owned land into this is a very powerful tool. It is, it's what we do because there's so much more you can accomplish if you're willing to put that into the mix. So.
And actually, it's interesting that you looked at the Irwin Hills. That was brought up to me last week. There's a project close to that was teacher housing, and actually I met with some of the Buncombe County schools and a school board member and a few people on the foundation, and they actually brought up some pretty serious concerns around teacher housing and looking at ways. So I just feel like that's something to put out there for us just to think about too as we're going forward. Not necessarily saying in one specific area here, but they are definitely having those conversations, and it is something that we've worked on in the past.
Right, using county-owned properties.
Yes.
So it was a good model and still is. So, Sarah, are you looking for feedback from the commission today, or what's the time frame that we need? Because we've got these 4 sites. We want to focus on 3 unless we decide otherwise. So what's the time frame for, saying it's these 3 and we'll take a pause on whatever site 4 is, at least for the time being? So, or Avril, are you looking for that today, or how much time do we have to mull this question over about who doesn't get to the next round?
Our precedent has been 2 weeks, so we will love to bring this back on the agenda for a vote and guidance by staff, because as Sarah mentioned, it would be funding, so we would have to come forward a budget amendment. I'm not going to put Matt on the spot because I promised him I wouldn't, but I would like for you to talk about taking money from the affordable housing to at least start that, because he does have some program income, but we don't have enough to do all the sites, so we'll bring that back next 2 weeks.
Okay. That sounds great. I'll say I'm definitely supportive of, if we need to do a budget amendment to keep the process moving ahead, utilizing some of would it be like funds that we would be planning to program into Affordable Housing Services program, but it would just be sort of going ahead and funding it now rather than
Correct.
waiting for the budget
Correct.
allocation?
So I think the program income piece, not the budget allocation piece, but the program income that he has earned to date.
Okay. Yeah, because I think these are very promising. I mean, I'm excited about the kind of, I'm looking forward to phase 2 when it gets into more detail, but there's great potential here, I think. So including with this Irwin site, looks really encouraging. Commissioners, other questions, comments?
As an aside, to address what Commissioner Wells specifically said, I know at one of our Affordable Housing Subcommittee meetings, Mr. Frew explained to us, and this is a little separate from DFI's work, but when we look at our affordable housing bonds, that it has to remain within a certain AMI, and it might be helpful to bring that forward at some point so that everyone outside of the three of us on that committee are aware of that, because I think it helps address some of those concerns that are going to come up, particularly within specific groups in our community, and how we can and cannot address some of those. Because that information was really helpful at that point. Just a statement as we move forward. Thank you, Sarah. This is exciting.
One other question, maybe just for right now. In terms of the the downtown properties and then the property in Irwin, you said you did 1 and 2 bedrooms as long as they were under, was it 80 or 90 unit developments? And then if they were over that, then you included some 3 bedrooms. And what was the mix of 1 and 2 bedroom units? Was it the same on each of the different sites for this
Operated
early?
on sort of an average of 870 square feet. So it was, the mix is sort of mushy when you're just drawing a box. So what we will do, though, is in this next phase, if you have kind of a mix that you're thinking about that you feel is lacking in the area, we're going to, we did look at the market analysis as part of this high level. That's why we skewed towards the 1 and 2. But there may be a greater need for 3 bedrooms for the project-based vouchers, for example, that we'll spend time looking at.
I guess just like one initial thought, just thinking about these different parts of the community. I mean, part of what's cool about the Irwin property is that it's located next to an elementary school, an intermediate school, and a high school. I mean, so it's like, it's kind of unique and, well, not completely unique, but it's like if you had a development there for families with kids, they're like within walking distance or super close to all these different schools. So it would be very attractive, I think, for a lot of families with kids in particular because of that proximity to schools, whereas the downtown properties, a lot more probably like workforce, right? Like people who work downtown maybe don't have kids yet, or maybe they're retired, want to live downtown, but probably less of like a lot of families with kids. So maybe just the downtown might be a lot more 1 bedrooms, or maybe 1 and 2. Whereas like Irwin Hill seems like a lot of people might have children or several children. That would be a particularly attractive site.
Yes, and we'll look carefully at that if we were to do Irwin Hills. And you're right, it is a great area in terms of schools and amenities.
Question I have, how long before we'll be able to dip into the bond money?
I mean, it's available now, right? We just need, so like when we go through our affordable housing services program applications this year, we've got our budgeted funds, but if there are, really compelling projects, we could make recommendations for funding some of those projects through bond funds. Because they're available, right? We just now need to connect them to good projects.
I'll say thank you. I'm very encouraged by the timeline that you're giving us. It's going to solve a lot of immediate concerns for a lot of people in our community. So we appreciate you putting that in our court.
Sure will, yeah, it's good.
All right, Sarah, thank you to you and everyone on your team. We look forward to talking again at our next meeting. All right. I'm excited that we have crypto on our agenda, finally, with something related to crypto. It sounds really edgy, so. Nate, thanks for being here.
Give me just a moment to get the presentation queued up.
This is a topic I literally know nothing about, so totally.
I was going to say, are we going to get a disclaimer about whether or not to invest in crypto?
No comment. So one of the things that's most exciting in the world of planning is emerging technologies. Just to sort of set the stage here, in the 1980s and the early 1990s, there was this thing called cell phones, and many people were fearful of them when they first came about, and there were a lot of pretty substantial and heavy regulations around telecommunication towers. And a lot has changed in that realm. So just to set the stage for our discussion today, I think a couple of you all may have been reached out to through your numerous platforms. And there has been some concern across the United States about a relatively new land use. What is the deal? Okay. around this particular land use itself. In your inboxes, you received a zoning practice report from the American Planning Association, and this is the professional organization of planners across the United States and in some cases the world. The reason I wanted to get this document out to you is when we talk about a new land use, it's important to have the most impartial information related to it. And we really want to differentiate between both cryptocurrency mining operations versus data centers, and it's important to know. So for the most basic of definitions, because this is a very, very complex situation involving a digital currency. The new emerging digital currencies, using Bitcoin as an example, is the way that they work is transactions take place all across the world in a digital form. This is actually a digital currency. The way that they actually perform these real world financial transactions is through complex mathematical calculations. And without going into great detail, the verification process is referred to as mining, and the reward as part of a mining operation is a fraction or part of a whole coin. So how does this work? How does this mining operation work? First of all, it's not a classic mine. It is, for lack of a better term, a very large building that is full of servers. And these servers are constantly performing calculations. The reason that we also want to be very careful here with server farms is that they can serve two functions. You might have an operation that's in a building that's crunching numbers all day long for cryptocurrency mining. You might also have a building that is performing calculations all day long for the purposes of serving internet, for the purposes of serving national climatic data center calculations. You know, back in the 80s, we had these large things called mainframes and supercomputers. This is today's current version. So, how this applies to land use. The facilities needed to house these types of operations require large warehouse-type facilities. Could one be located in Buncombe County? The zoning ordinance does not outright define cryptocurrency mining as specific use, but there is generic classification, storage, and warehousing. So what the school government says is that you need to be really specific. You don't need to be really specific in terms of the zoning ordinance is not going to identify every single use that comes about. So planners have the task every day of matching them up to the most closely related facility. So in this case, we would probably be required to permit an operation like this no different than any other data center, i.e. like Facebook, Google, or any other large company that has the need. You know, you have your, I don't really keep up with social media, but you have your Instagrams and all your different things that kids use every day. It's important to note that we have not received any active applications, and I will say this. Many operations look for, in other jurisdictions, they're after plentiful, inexpensive, flat developable land, something that we don't have a lot of. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Your options now are, one, to do nothing. If an application came in, we would have to look at areas, commercial zoned areas that have warehousing and storage is allowed in the permitted use table. I will also say that operations like this, just because of the way they operate, they also need a lot of water for cooling purposes. You've got to keep these things cool. And in this guide, I'm not going to go into great detail, but it explains all that in great detail. One other option available to you, and here's something that is very interesting because it is extraordinarily limited in scope. You do have the opportunity, because I cannot make you a guarantee right now that one might not come in the door, to enact a one-year moratorium. This is allowed by state statute through 160D. It is very narrow in scope, but could be utilized here. This gives staff time to develop recommendations and standards and bring something back to you. We work with the planning board. We could say, hey, We could do design standards. We could do a number of different things because there are some things you want to, maybe want to mitigate. And those include noise specifically. And that means you have them in an enclosed building. So those are your two options that you would have before you today. This is the process that we would follow. Now, because we are not doing a text amendment at this point, this is an item that would come to you, but we have to follow this process. This is 160D. It says you have to hold a public hearing, and a moratorium is essentially a stay. It gives you time. It gives you time for staff to work through the proper channels, and you do have to include the following 4 required statements. That tells you to identify the problem, describe the development approvals that are subject to the moratorium, meaning define the scope, keep it narrow to the thing that we're trying to regulate, indicate the date of termination, and include a statement of actions. And this would be an action where legal and planning would work directly together to bring to you. Now, I'm leaving it for discussion where we are seeking direction on what you might want to advise staff to do, given what I've just presented. Here for any questions that you may have as well.
Can I offer as a question, or I guess just point?
Sure.
If this were something we were to entertain, is there a way, I guess we'd want to consider narrowly tailoring this to specifically address crypto as opposed to disincentivizing companies like Google or other, I won't say legitimate or illegitimate, but more traditional uses of this type of operation?
Great point. That would be probably staff's recommendation here.
And
No.
is that something that we can do under a moratorium scenario? Because it sounds like in the permitted use table, from like a legal perspective, it's the same land use, essentially.
So you would actually be passing a moratorium on a very specific thing that's not defined in the use table.
Okay.
And you're allowed to do that,
Okay.
even with the way things are structured now. Both the county attorney and I have discussed this at length. And there have been other instances in North Carolina where at least one community that I'm aware of has passed a moratorium. There is another community that I would tell you too that had a very interesting scenario where they actually built one of these things and it was not in a building. It was in a series of cargo containers.
And from my understanding, right, is the proof of work cryptocurrency that is kind of this really energy intensive. I guess there's different types of this cryptocurrency mining. So to Commissioner Moore's point, like really being able to kind of dig into that. But it's that proof of work that is extremely energy intensive, as well as it produces a lot of e-waste as well, because I think those little servers or whatever are about the size of a toaster oven, and about after 12 months or so, they're having to replace those, so you do end up with a pretty significant amount of e-waste from it as well. So just from those environmental points, those are a couple of things. And then the cooling, like you said, so you're either got the noise, if it's the air cooled and it's outside, or if you're dealing with the water, then there's some communities where this has been happening, it's caused issues with the water as well.
And you can recirculate the water. I will say, interestingly enough, they do seek cooler climates. So you see some clusters in this bulletin as well, specifically out west. There's a large cluster of mainly more data center that's up in the Virginia area, which has a technology corridor. But one thing that's interesting is there's nothing that prevents someone at home from being a miner. It's just they can't compete with the scale of operation of these large commercial operations that are taking place.
I appreciate the documentation that you sent us. In that one, I think the Missoula, Montana, there was some interesting ways that they went about trying to handle the situation. So I do appreciate the research and what you've sent us to look at.
Okay.
Nate, there's as Commissioner Wells reminded me, it's an intensive use of power. So there's a community, I think it's Franklinton, North Carolina, where a facility was built or proposed that's deconstructing tires and burning the component parts to create electricity to mine crypto. And is that kind of like unusual power generation land use something that's currently allowed in our zoning ordinance, whether it's related to crypto or whatever?
I would wonder how they got an air quality permit for that.
Yeah.
Would be my first observation, but not knowing enough about that specifically, that'd be something I'd probably want to return to you and report on.
And I do think probably one of the areas you mentioned earlier with the cargo is at Cherokee County. And I did hear from some of the folks that live there that definitely, because they weren't proactive, they're dealing with it on this end now, and there's a lot of frustration. So I appreciate you looking at this in a proactive way. But I think it was during the holidays, they said they actually had some rolling blackouts. No, I'm not saying whether it's directly related or not. They felt it was. I'm supportive of the moratorium.
And if you don't mind, I'd love to see I guess, to comply with what we would need to legally, just what the actual reasons would be defined specific to our community. If
The
that could be
whereas
part of,
clauses to meet the standards that are laid out in 160D.
correct.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's interest in considering a moratorium on this. So yeah, if staff could draft up something for us specifically to look at that would lay out the required basis for it, then that'd be great. And when would we be able to
Report back.
consider that?
Did you have a process, like, is it the 2-week thing again that I heard?
I'm looking at Fruka, he is down a man in his office, so that might be a couple more than maybe the second meeting in March.
I think we could do it by then for sure. And then it'd be again, if the board is interested, it'd be a public hearing with notice for 2 consecutive weeks. So it'd be late April, the soonest, I think, before we could adopt it.
And we have to have all of that language fleshed out in order to hold the first public hearing.
That'd be the foundation of the findings for the board to substantiate the
Okay.
ordinance.
All right, well, if that's as soon as we can do it, that sounds good. If it comes together to do it sooner, then we can start the process sooner. So any other questions or thoughts from commissioners? All right. Nate, Michael, thank you for bringing this up. I know it's been a topic people have been interested in learning more about, so we appreciate the presentations and process info. All right, commissioners, that's everything we had on our briefing meeting. So we'll adjourn this meeting and reconvene at 5 o'clock for the regular meeting.